Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras, A Changing America. I'm Casey Counts. The New Mexico PBS-produced documentary, Law for a Lawless Land, really tells the story of a changing America. It's the story of the judiciary during New Mexico's territorial years. The complicated landscape provided a true challenge to the rule of law as it was being established and applied by the U.S. government in a place that had its own set of rules. Documentary producer and filmmaker Tara Walch and executive producer for Arts and Cultural Affairs, Michael Kamins, join us on the program to talk about the making of Law for a Lawless Land. And later, historian Paul Andrew Hutton tells us more about how territorial judges carved out their place in New Mexico's history. First, welcome Tara and Michael to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Tara, let's start with you and talk a little bit about the concept for Law for a Lawless Land. How did the seed of the idea come about?
The seed of the idea came about when Judge James Browning, he said this thing where a lot of judges will write a book, and he decided that he would like a film that would share something about Mexico's judiciary. And so he approached New Mexico PBS, and the U.S. District Court of New Mexico Bench and Bar Fund brought funding to produce a documentary about New Mexico's territorial history through the eyes of the federal judiciary. So that kind of started everything off.
So I'm wondering, Michael, maybe you can kind of speak to, okay, where do I begin?
Where do I begin? Well, you always begin with a great idea, and this was a great idea. It was a great story. I'm looking, at New Mexico often through all the programs we do, but there's always something to discover. There's always something new and rich, and this was one of those opportunities that popped up. And we can't thank the Bench and Bar Fund enough, or Judge Browning, the whole judiciary, because they were right there. They were participants from the very beginning, and saw the possibility of this story, and saw the possibility of us collaborating and bringing this to New Mexicans. And I got to tell you, I'm always learning something in this job, so I really loved it.
That is for sure. And you must have embarked on a pretty massive research endeavor. Tara, why don't you tell us first about how you began the research phase of the project?
I really began by trying to, understand what historians have looked at, what, things like that. And then I decided to go down to the Center for Southwest Research at UNM's library and found a book that had recorded a bunch of the cases. So a lot of the cases from that territorial period are in this, book. It's like a New Mexico Reports, law book. And so I started looking through those and reading into that law of that period, trying to understand maybe what cases we could look at, because that's where the judges' voices are. There are a few letters, that were found and stuff like that. But most of the perspective of the judiciary comes through those cases. And so delving into that was really interesting. And that really opened the subject up for me, and then looking at photography, trying to understand, what, things look like, what people, were faced with, looking at the landscape, looking at the judges' portraits, things like that.
When it came down to picking and choosing which cases were going to make it into this documentary, how did you narrow it down?
It was really hard. I think I wanted it to represent, the diversity of New Mexico and the language issues in New Mexico, and the kind of people that are involved and were involved, and often you don't see a lot about those cases. So I mean, you don't see much about cases of the law in territorial New Mexico history. It's one of those things you don't really think about. You think about all of the gunfights, and you think about the railroads, and you think about, all of that kind of stuff. But when you're looking at the cases, it is really interesting to understand that they were looking at language as an issue, even in this really early time. The Spanish language, the law that was written in Spanish and had been in New Mexico for a very long time, Herbie Benedict took that into his perspective. And so I thought that was really interesting. There were a number of cases about the Pueblos and their part and what they were going through, and how the judiciary and the legal system worked with them or not, and how that was figured out. So to kind of take a look at the different elements of New Mexico's, society and people that are here, and try to come at it from those different points of view, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So choosing cases around that.
Michael, I wanted to give you a chance first. Tara mentioned, finding pictures and finding letters, and, that's just a beginning to what you want to have in a finished product in terms of the visuals. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about the process that you went through to create those visuals for the audience.
Well, you're leading into something that we tried for the very first time. At the very beginning of the production on this, or let's say pre-production, we knew there was going to be some historical elements that just weren't going to have any kind of archival or historical illustrative material. So Tara did just a fantastic job of finding photography and such from the period, but we knew, like I was saying, that there was just going to be some things that we just couldn't find the right visuals. And TV being a visual medium, we decided to take a chance on AI and using artificial intelligence imagery, generative imagery, to help us, tell the story in a way that probably hadn't been told before. So with a lot of research and a lot of, taking efforts to look at, how to tell these stories, how to keep it historically accurate, how to, not distort anything, but hopefully add to the storytelling. We began a process, and I jumped in and basically spent a few months learning how to do generative imagery. And I think it really worked for us. We chose an illustrative style, so it's very clearly identified that, these are AI materials. At the beginning and at the end of the show, we make notice of that. We put together a little web page to describe how, we helped kind of visualize the past, and that's the title of the web page, and talk about our process of not only finding the historical materials, but also creating some of the generative AI imagery that we included. There's a long history of courtroom illustrations, and we thought, well, here's a new tool to help us kind of, grab hold of that historical precedent and bring it to life through this new tool. And, there's a scene in there that really kind of helped us bring this history to life. It's there's a gunfight between Reinerson and Chief Justice Slough, and it didn't go well for Slough, and we kind of did our own little movie scene about that. And I encourage everybody to look at it because, we really want to engage people with the story, and feel that some of these new tools that gave us an opportunity to do it in a way we haven't done before.
What was frustrating about that project, or maybe you got some laughs along the way while you were working with that new technology?
Oh, I've said before, and I'll say it again, it's like trying to train a cat. It's got its own mind of things, and so you stay really persistent and you keep after it, and have a good dialogue, not only with the technology, but with the people involved with the project, with Tara and everybody, had their input, and keeping it historically accurate, but just trying to take this new technology, which even when we did it last February and March, has evolved so much now that we would probably find it a lot easier. But trial and error, being cautious, being transparent, and thinking that it is going to work. It is going to work, and we kept trying it. And and I think we succeeded. I think we were able to bring something to the storytelling again that probably without all that effort, it was worth it. With all that effort, it was certainly worth doing it. And I hope people, when they look at the doc, will agree.
So Tara, I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about what surprised you in terms of how people responded to each other, and especially how judges in New Mexico carved out their place in the state.
I think what surprised me is the evolution of it. Like in the beginning, there were judges that were not trained in the law. They were, they had been in New Mexico, they knew New Mexico, they had mercantiles, or they had been traders, trading goods and everything, but they weren't judges and they weren't lawyers. But then Kirby Benedict comes into New Mexico in 1853 with a really comprehensive legal knowledge, and he applies that to New Mexico. And he's this really interesting guy too. I mean, he has a relationship with Abraham Lincoln. He rode the circuit in Illinois with Abraham Lincoln. And so, his perspective into the law is very serious, but he's also this really colorful person. And then towards the end of the documentary, we start getting into where, the judges do have a background in legal history or in the law, and they know what they're doing. And they're really honestly, for the most part, I think, trying to bring, justice to New Mexico. And Judge Brownie says that in the documentary, but I think it's truly the thing that they're trying to do is fit it into New Mexico. It's not just overlaying it necessarily. They're really trying to connect to the culture, connect to people, and make it work. And that was really interesting. I think, if not a little bit surprising. Yeah.
All of those complications, I know, were played a role in the difficulty New Mexico had becoming a state. I want to talk a little bit, with a little bit of time we have left, about, because if you've watched the documentary, if you watched it last week here on KRWG Public Media, you may have heard the familiar voice, recognized the voice of Sam Donaldson. And so, as a bit of a fan myself, I just have to ask, what was it like working with Sam?
Oh, he's such a gentleman. It was wonderful to work with Sam. He's gracious with his time. He really cared about the project, the history of it and everything. And so it just felt like he was really engaged and he knew what he was talking about. And he brings that gravity to it. But to work with him was quite an honor. I mean, he has a wonderful background. He has great experience, and he's just very straightforward and kind. Wonderful to work with him.
And Michael, I'd like for you to offer some takeaways from this project. And, obviously it was a bit of a new experience, it sounds like, for you. What do you take away from this?
Oh boy, how much time do we have? I would say I take away the idea that we're still learning about New Mexico, and the past is very much the present. And that it's good to know where we've come from, and people who have worked so hard to get us where we are today, and to know those stories, and to understand the meaning of these efforts, and looking at what the judges did. They haven't had a lot of attention and historically, and I hope this adds kind of a new chapter. When we produce documentaries, we want to do something that's, that fits the kind of paradigm that PBS has, throughout its inception, from its inception. And I think that's what guides us to hopefully do something meaningful for audiences. And I think this is a good example of the work we do in the PBS system. And I hope people take away with what I took away. And that was a real learning experience, but also an understanding. And that's important. And I think that's why I do the work. And it's not really work. I mean, it's an opportunity to do something that contributes. And I hope people watch this because I learned so much, and I hope they get the same value out of it that I did.
How about you, Tara?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I felt was really important was to try to put people there, try to give a real perspective into that history. You know, the music is from the time period, the imagery, the photography, you know, the stories, the history, the cases, like being able to look at those books. I wanted to be able to put people there. And so I hope that it, you know, opens curiosity. I hope it gives, you know, people the impetus to ask why and how all these things happen, like even more, and delve into the history even more. That's why I do it. And so to bring an element of that curiosity forward is quite an honor. So I really hope that it puts people there and gives people a chance to, you know, ask those questions about our history.
And people can, if they missed the documentary last week here on KRWG Public Media, find it at NMPBS.org. Tara Walch, producer and filmmaker, and Michael Kamins, executive producer for Arts and Cultural Affairs with New Mexico PBS. Thank you both so much for talking about making the documentary. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And before we welcome historian Paul Andrew Hutton to the program, let's take a look at this segment about a case that still haunts the Mesilla Valley: the disappearance and presumed murder of Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain and his 8-year-old son, Henry.
On February 1st, 1896, Civil War hero and leading New Mexico Republican politician Colonel Albert Jennings Fountain and his 8-year-old son Henry vanished near White Sands while returning home to Mesilla from Lincoln. All that was found at the murder scene was a blood-stained buckboard, some papers, and the little boy's bandana.
He was the lead prosecutor in Doñana County, and he was investigating various crimes, including cattle rustling, and was bringing charges by indictment.
That was like breaking the code. You don't kill a young boy who's innocent.
Suspicion centered around ranchers Albert Bacon Fall and Oliver Lee, who were bitter rivals of the colonel. Fountain had been in Lincoln to obtain warrants for cattle rustling against Lee and his cowboys. Fall, who Fountain had recently defeated for the territorial legislature, was Lee's attorney.
Judge Frank Parker, just after taking office, finds himself presiding over one of the most notoriously political cases ever held in the courts of New Mexico.
Sheriff Pat Garrett led a posse after Lee and one of his cowboys, Jim Gilliland, in July 1898. A gunfight ensued near Alamogordo, in which one of Garrett's deputies was mortally wounded and the suspects escaped.
Oliver Lee starts dictating how he's going to turn himself in. He says, I am not going to spend a night in the jail of Pat Garrett. I will not turn myself into Pat Garrett. He might have actually been a little bit afraid of Pat Garrett.
Lee brazenly wrote a letter to the Las Cruces Independent Democrat claiming self-defense. This outraged the editor of the El Paso Times. In New Mexico, Oliver Lee, after killing an officer of the law, sends the papers a graphic description of the fight he made and tells why he will not be arrested by this or that officer. And still, some people wonder why New Mexico is not admitted to statehood.
Pat Garrett was there and saw his deputy shot, so he saw the crime. He didn't have to do an investigation. He didn't have to rely on hearsay or witnesses or heard something took place over here. He's there. He saw it.
As Garrett's manhunt intensified, Lee and Gilliland surrendered. Fall wanted them tried in the friendly confines of Otero County, where Lee was something of a folk hero. But presiding Judge Frank Parker moved the venue to Hillsboro. 90 witnesses were summoned to trial. Practicing law in Doñana County for 17 years, knowing the people well, Judge Parker's first remark was, "Gentlemen coming into the court will kindly leave their guns outside."
It's very dangerous. You know, the judges, you have to admire them because they risk their lives trying to apply the rule of law and see that justice is served.
When Garrett was on the stand, Fall asked him, well, why did you wait so long to bring the case? And he said, because you controlled the courts, which just said everything about what was going on in the territory at that time.
Witnesses provided alibis for the accused, and Fall was unrelenting about this being a case of political persecution. It was nearly midnight. The jury was out for 7 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. The gallery cheered.
Oliver Lee has a friend in Albert Bacon Fall. The Democrats have some power there in southern New Mexico. It's kind of seen in a way as the forces opposed to the Santa Fe ring getting a victory. Who lost? Albert Jennings Fountain and his little boy. They didn't get justice. They were murdered.
I was encouraged, actually, to see the steps that Judge Parker took to bring about a fair proceeding, and regardless of the result, that the process itself and even his decision to relocate the trial to Hillsborough was a huge step in the right direction to establishing the rule of law and confidence in this new system of American justice.
Law for a Lawless Land, the New Mexico PBS-produced documentary, can be streamed at newmexicopbs.org/visualizing the past. And joining us now from the documentary is historian Paul Andrew Hutton, who serves as Tate Chair of Western History at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Casey. Thanks for having me.
Well, we just saw a clip from the documentary about a case that still haunts the Mesilla Valley, and that is the disappearance and presumed murder of Albert Jennings Fountain and his 8-year-old son, Henry. Why do you think that's one of those cases that shows us that interesting judicial history of New Mexico?
Well, it's one of the great unsolved mysteries in all of the American West, and authors have been trying to untangle it for generations now, really without success, although some believe that they've done so. But as a case of jurisprudence gone awry, it's just perfect for the show that we produce. We wanted to talk about the difficulties that the territorial courts had and the whole problem of kind of local mindset as opposed to control from outside. In this sense, we just meet Santa Fe. And so as I was researching this story to write the script for our show, and in fact, the title of the show refers almost exactly to this case. I was fascinated by the complexity of it. And so it really is the Santa Fe ring against the ranchers in southern New Mexico. And you've got some of the most oversized personalities, you know, in all of New Mexico history, playing out their role in this. And it's just an absolutely fascinating story. And was justice served? Absolutely not. Lee was somehow involved with that murder, and they just couldn't get the goods on him. And then, of course, it goes into Pat Garrett's murder later, because Garrett, trying to redeem his reputation as a lawman, because he brought in Billy the Kid, he won't give up on it. So he's going to meet a sad fate as well. And in fact, I mean, one of the things that Lee did was get in a gunfight with Pat Garrett's posse, and in that gunfight, one of Garrett's deputies is killed. So Garrett is an actual witness to the murder of a deputy by a suspected felon resisting arrest. It's still, he walks, because the people in that part of the country just weren't going to convict him, and the jury was so tainted.
What do you think is one message that you would like for people to take about Some of the heroes of the judiciary during New Mexico's territorial time.
Well, we had a classic example in the Lee trial. In fact, the judge orders folks to leave their guns outside. My goodness, And this judge had placed himself in a very dangerous situation, and still, even though there's no conviction of who some of us, like myself, think is the murderer, the law worked its way through. And the show itself is about the courage of these judges, the travails that they encountered as they tried to bring law to this lawless land. And I think that case is just a classic example. There's a wonderful letter. We mentioned it in the show that was in the El Paso newspaper, complaining about justice in New Mexico, and it ends with, and these people think they should be a state? It was like, wow. Indeed,
one of the things that made the path to statehood so complicated, right?
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, just it was tough. It was tough to admit to the Union a state that was just so lawless. Of course, there were a lot of other reasons that went into our late statehood. We could have been a state at the end of the Mexican-American War, of course.
Well, maybe we can have you back on New Mexico Statehood Day for that one.
Right.
All right. Well, historian and Tate Chair of Western History at the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, Paul Andrew Hutton, thank you so much for joining us to talk about the documentary. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to New Mexico PBS producer and filmmaker Tara Walch, and the executive producer for Arts and Culture for New Mexico PBS, Michael Kamins. And thank you for watching Fronteras, A Changing America on KRWG Public Media, made possible by viewers like you. You can find this episode or any of our local programs and segments at krwg.org, where you can sign up to receive our Friday news wrap delivered every week to your inbox from KRWG Public Media.